From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. Kaena Point by C.H. Sherman. Dan Lomax's spirits fell when all he saw on the way to the Mauna Hotel were pizza parlors and more hotels. After the ugliness of the past year with Denise, soon to be the ex-Mrs. Lomax, he was desperate to surround himself with the exotic beauty of Hawaii. But he needn't have despaired. Oahu's beauty revived him despite civilization's interference. He lay on the beach the first 2 days, allowing the pineapple-scented sea breezes to relax, then invigorate him. By the 3rd day he was ready to cleanse himself with adventure. He answered a corny ad by a Captain Cook Jr., but it was the only one that offered off-the-beaten-track day trips. Dan paid extra for a private trip, so the guide picked him up in a purple Army surplus Jeep early Thursday morning. Cook was right out of central casting, 60-ish with scraggly silver hair, an eye patch, and of all things, a black derby. Definitely not a native islander. He chewed stick after stick of dentine and talked with a distinct New Jersey accent about the wonders of his Hawaiian paradise. Yes, sir. You got everything you need on the islands. You got the beach, you got the mountains, you got the nightclubs, you got the hula girls, you got the best damn Chinese food I ever ate except maybe Hong Fats in Chinatown. I'm talking New York now, not San Francisco, you know what I'm saying. But hey, you got tours and you got tours. Now, anybody can take you to see the Arizona or the Dole Pavilion or Queen Emma Summer Palace. But you want something different. You want a little excitement. You want something to get old Pele all hot and bothered. You come with Cookie here. I'll give you a vacation you'll never forget. Know what I'm saying? Pele, the soccer player? Cook roared. No, kiddo. Pele's a goddess. Natives here always try to stay on her good side. They think she makes the volcanoes erupt when she blows a gasket. Don't make no difference what the scientist says. It's Pele's fault. Know what I'm saying? You got to abide by her rules or she'll clobber you. Just then, Dan's hat blew off. It was an expensive new Panama he'd bought specifically for the trip. He had quite a selection of hats and was always adding to it. At 51, he was well on the way to total baldness. His hair had been thinning since his early 20s, but over the last 3 years with little hair he had finally decided to fall out. Just a few sturdy strands graced his scalp. He had considered growing the sides long and sweeping them across to camouflage the old billiard ball, but he couldn't stand the possibility of looking like a lopsided fool in the wind and rain. If he could change one thing in his life, it would be his hairline. It might have saved his marriage. Dan was only a year older than Denise, the demure half of the dynamic duo of Danbury. But as things got more strained between them, she made it worse by referring to him as the old man and an old fart. Jokingly, of course. The last time she did it, Dan smashed her box of seashells that she'd been collecting since college. The next day she moved in with her sister. Cook pulled off the road so Dan could run back to get his hat. He was red-faced and out of breath when he climbed back into the Jeep. Don't want you getting sunstroke on me, laughed Cook, as he popped a few more sticks of dentine into his mouth. Hold on to your hats. He gunned the engine and they took off. We're heading for Kaena Point, big fella. You won't find another guide who'll even tell you about it. Legend has it that it's the cliff where the souls of the dead jump off into eternal night. We'll have to do some heavy-duty hiking, though. You know what I'm saying? No cars near the top. You game? Is it safe? As long as it's daylight, we're fine. Of course, I don't plan on being up there at night. Too remote. But we'll be there and back by late afternoon. If we keep moving. It wasn't exactly what Dan had in mind when he said he wanted adventure. Was it possible to have adventure without danger? He was in pretty good shape, physically at least, and this was definitely different. Besides, Cook never said it would be dangerous. I'm game. It didn't take them very long to get to the end of the paved road. The Jeep rattled through scruffy underbrush until Cook took mercy on both the Jeep's suspension and his passenger's kidneys. He aimed for a giant palm and let the car stall at its base. Beginning to question his guide's sense of humor, Dan opted for a Rolaids tablet instead of Cook's offer of Dentyne. The sun beat down with an amazing fierceness. Dan was tempted to take off everything except his hat and LL Bean hiking shorts, but he knew his skin would blister within minutes. He gratefully followed Cook into an overgrown jungle. What a difference between the Hawaii, most touristy, and his throwback to some prehistoric era. Even the blazing sun couldn't break through the bushes. The heavy air misted around them. Dan brushed aside sticky lime green vines dangling overhead from tops of trees too high up to be seen. Giant leafy ferns blocked their paths and scraped against their legs. As they waded through the undergrowth, invisible birds made strange music. After an hour, Dan was winded and drinking and also thinking about ways to convince Cook to head back without admitting to his weakness. Breathing was getting harder, and he was very aware that 51 was indeed 51. He didn't want to collapse in some godforsaken jungle and have to be hauled out by a real old fart. He had just made a pact with himself to hang on for another 15 minutes when they came to a clearing. The sun spotlighted a narrow, rickety bridge about 25 feet long, suspended from two giant trees over a wide pool of dark water. The far side was rocky, mountainous, with much less vegetation. Nailed to a post near the foot of the bridge was a sign, "Cross at your own risk. This bridge has not been blessed." Underneath, someone had scratched in pencil, "Kapu, the god's command." Dan stopped short. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread as he stared at the lagoon. Too many scary movies as a child haunted him even now. Middle-aged unease played its part as well. Cook turned and watched him. "It'll be easier on the other side. You game?" Dan tried to remember why he had come and what he was looking for. "There's no other way to cross?" "Okay, we'll head back. No sense doing something if it scares the hell out of you." "Wait," shouted Dan, still trying to catch his breath. "I'm just wondering about the sign. What does Kapu mean?" "It just means warning. There's nothing to worry about. They're Hawaiian gods, right? Hawaiian superstitions, right? You and me ain't Hawaiian, so there's no problem. You know what I'm saying?" Still, Dan hesitated. "Okay, I can drop you off at Queen Emma's before it closes." Cook brushed past him with a disgusted look on his face. "Wait a minute. I'll go across. The bridge just doesn't seem all that safe, blessed or not." Dan was embarrassed by his need to be back in the older man's good graces. "I'm not dressed for a swim, you know what I'm saying?" "It's stronger than it looks, trust me. You game?" "Yeah, I'm game." The guide grinned. He slapped Dan on the back and pushed him toward the bridge. Cook, chuckling like an old little boy, took out his wad of gum and plopped it on top of the warning sign. Together they stepped onto the wooden slats and crossed gingerly to the middle, while the bridge swayed and creaked. "See? Strong enough for 10 men. Hold on to the sides so you won't get seasick." With that, Cook started bouncing up and down. Dan grabbed for the rope supports, but fell to his knees. Cook hooted and hollered. He jumped as high as he could and yelled the banshee cry that made the unseen bird screech. "Buzz off, you pitiful gods!" He squealed with laughter and danced a crazy dance as the bridge swayed more strongly. Dan stared at his guide, gone mad. Cook clumped back and forth in his noisy army boots, oblivious to his charge's discomfort. Dan quavered, afraid to move, afraid of Cook's bizarre behavior. Cook pranced the length of the bridge, climbing on the ropes and cackling like a hyena. At the far end, he cocked his derby hat at a jaunty angle and turned back to Dan, who was still on his knees. "What are you doing? Praying?" Still midway on the swinging bridge, Dan glared at Cook, lounging safely on the other side. When he got close enough, he would punch the old buzzard in the nose. Slowly he stood up. Then rocking of the bridge actually made him nauseous. Cook hollered him, "Come on, sport. It ain't gonna fall." Still laughing, Cook bounded back across the bridge. Dan started to wave him away but lost his footing and fell flat. Suddenly he heard a ripping sound and looked up in time to see the ropes closest to him spiral downward. The bridge twisted and tilted as the planks groaned. Cook, frozen like a strung-up marionette, mirrored Dan's own disbelief and fear. He reached for Dan seconds before the bridge crashed into the water, spilling both of them into the lagoon. The boards Dan was clutching wrenched out of his hands when he hit the icy water. The shock of the impact stunned him. His chest heaved. He struggled to hold on to what little air he had left. A board bashed his head. Blinding pain. Something clawed his ankle, pulling him down. He kicked in terror at it as his lungs screamed for air. His foot connected with something both pulpy and scaly. The hold on him released. An eternity later, Dan broke surface. He gagged and choked and gulped air into his lungs. The sunlight dazzled him. Never a good swimmer, he splashed his way desperately to the shore, dragged himself onto land, and crawled over rocks and spiky grass to get as far away as possible from the lagoon and the thing that had grabbed him. Only when his legs gave out did he stop and turn around. Though he felt the sun beating down on him, he couldn't stop shivering. His ankle was scraped and bruised. His head throbbed. Blood gushed from a deep cut above his eyebrow. Dan retched again and again, throwing up breakfast and pond water. Shaking and sweating in his muck, he suddenly remembered Cook. Where was he? Had he escaped? He tried to call out, but his voice cracked. He hacked and spat until he could make sounds, then called again. There was no answer. He thought of the thing that gripped his ankle. Could it have been Cook? He didn't want to go back into the water and see Cook's mangled body or bloated face, but the chance that he might be trapped alive in the debris made Dan crawl back to the edge of the lagoon to look. The collapsed bridge dangled brokenly from one last support rope on the opposite bank, where the warning sign still stood. The water was deeper than Dan realized. The bridge's other end was totally submerged. He splashed in the shallows and shouted for Cook to please God be alive, but there was no answer. Then Dan saw the old guide's battered derby floating near some loose planks on the other side. Cook was gone, and Dan was too afraid to go back into the water to look for him. He felt like a coward. Hugging himself, rocking back and forth, Dan began to cry. Finally he passed out in pure exhaustion. When he woke up dizzy and sore, a stiff wind was blowing and it was almost dark. He was chilled in his damp clothes. His ankle felt swollen and his head ached. When he touched his forehead, dried blood flaked onto his fingertips. Dan had no idea how long he'd slept, but he knew he had to get away from there and get help. Stumbling to his feet, he tried to find a path. The vegetation was rough. He needed a way down, but the only clear areas were above. Maybe, he thought, he could circle around and come down on the other side of the bridge. He started off. Dark clouds hung overhead. The only sound he heard was the whistling of the wind. Then Dan saw a movement in the shadows off to his right. He squinted and caught a glimpse of silver hair. It was Cook. His scraggly hair was plastered to his head and his clothes were dripping wet. Dan called his name. Cook stopped and slowly turned around. His left arm was bent backwards, obviously badly broken. His eye patch was gone. A gaping hole stared blankly where an eye had been. A jagged gash in his neck oozed black blood. The old man saw Dan and smiled crookedly. "You game?" he asked. "Trust me." Dan jerked back from the gnarled hand Cook offered him. He couldn't bear to touch it. The old man winked his good eye, then turned away as a sudden wind knocked Dan to the ground. Rain gushed down and pelted him with drops the size of pebbles. Thunder cracked overhead. He felt rather than heard Cook calling to him, urging him on. With the wind and rain slashing at him, Dan began to crawl painfully through the underbrush. Lightning ripped the sky. Ahead of him he saw Cook working his way up an incline. Dazed, Dan rose to his feet and followed, limping. Raindrops stung his face, and heavy air clogged his chest. But Dan hobbled on, unable to turn back. In his mind, over and over again, a mantra repeated itself soundlessly. Cook is dead. Cook is dead. Cook is dead. Now he knew where the old man was headed, where he must follow. Kaena Point. The cliff where dead souls jump off into. What? The dark? Eternal night? Hell? Thunder and lightning shattered the sky. All the petty stupidities of his life came back to him. The memory of each ugly thing he'd ever said to his wife and family. All the things he'd never done. The unfulfilled dreams, missed opportunities. All the selfish, destructive, miserable ways he had ruined his life poured down on him, making him weep, making each step unbearable and heavy. He threw himself to the ground, moaning. He wanted to drown in the storm, to let the mud fill his mouth, to let the rain tear the skin from his bones. A high-pitched, inhuman wail pierced his brain, and his body was yanked forward. He caught at a jutting boulder, dug his fingers deep into the ground, and scraped his feet against slippery rocks, but he couldn't resist the force dragging him to Kaena Point to join Cook. Their destiny was sealed on that cursed bridge. Only, I'm not dead yet. The black and green sky burst into flame, and Dan saw Cook's ghost floating ahead of him near the edge of the cliffs. Smiling, the battered, crushed old man motioned for Dan to follow. "It'll be easier on the other side. Trust me." He grinned, blood dribbling from his mouth. "No! I'm alive, you son of a bitch!" A powerful gust of wind shoved Dan closer to the cliff. Cook laughed as Dan scrambled desperately for something to hold on to. His chin scraped a jagged rock. The invisible power suffocated him. Lightning flashed again and he saw he was on the very edge. Dan jammed his knee into a crevice and dangled on the ledge as Cook's spirit leapt off Kaena Point, falling end over end until it disappeared in the oily blackness. The roar of the ocean drowned its last horrifying wail. Dan closed his eyes against the horror, against the awful power that was sucking his life away. He saw his wife's face, the face of the woman he had sworn to love so long ago. The emptiness of his soul cried out, "Another chance! One more chance to make it right!" He didn't want death, not yet, not this way. If he were allowed to live, he would change. He swore it. "I don't want to die!" "Then you shall not." A woman's voice whispered in his ear, and strong arms lifted him away from the edge of the cliff. Muscles still taut with fear, Dan felt himself cradled against the woman's soft breast. She was warm and dry. His body vibrated as she began to croon a strange low melody. Incredibly, The storm quietened and died. Like a child he lay in her arms while the moon slipped out from behind the clouds. The moonlight shone on the woman's delicately beautiful face, the most wonderfully beautiful woman Dan had ever seen. He reached up and wrapped a strand of her wild, pale hair between his fingers. She smiled and stroked his face as she sang. His breathing slowed. The tension drained from his body. He inhaled her musky fragrance and stared at the curves of her mouth as she spoke. You here are a stranger. I know already that this is not your time. But you have trifled with the gods, and now see you their power? Implore their forgiveness, and I will give you and see that you return with safety. Dan managed to croak weakly. Please, I beg their forgiveness. But what about Cook? In death his spirit is the same as it was in life. Sleep now, Hawley. I protect you. She kissed the top of his head. He must have fallen asleep immediately, because he didn't remember anything until he was awakened in daylight by a jitney driver who found him lying alongside Farrington Highway. When Dan told him about the strange woman, the driver questioned him carefully as to whether or not he had shown her respect. Dan explained that he owed his life to her. The jitney driver beamed. You have great fortune. The goddess Pele is not always so gracious. The driver made a great to-do over Dan and told everyone they saw back at the hotel how the Americans stateside had seen Pele. Even the police who questioned Dan about Cook's disappearance were eager to hear about the mysterious woman. With the help of other guides, Dan was able to show the authorities where the collapsed bridge was. They found Cook's body the second day, pinioned beneath splintered boards, his left arm bent backwards, and his eye patch missing. Dan was cleared of any wrongdoing and flew back home the next day. His mind reeled from his brush with death, but visions of ghosts were tempered by visions of goddesses. Eventually, the nightmares of falling into the blackness with Cook disturbed his sleep less often, and every time he looked in the mirror he said a prayer of thanks to Pele, if indeed that was she, for the kiss that gave him a full head of hair. Second chances should benefit enough.